In the quiet corners of England, long before the days of modern marriage laws and the freedoms we often take for granted today, there existed a darker, more complex side to the bonds of matrimony. Marriages, in those days, were often less about love and more about necessity, survival, financial stability, and the perpetuation of family lines. Yet, within this framework, a strange, unsettling practice began to take root. It was during the 17th and 18th centuries, a time when England was experiencing massive social and economic upheaval, that wife-selling became a phenomenon. This practice was never officially sanctioned by law, but it gained a disturbing foothold in certain parts of the country. It was a moment in history where the unthinkable had become almost commonplace, and people, especially women, had few rights to their own lives. The idea of selling one's wife, treating her like a commodity to be passed from one man to another, seemed to some like an uncomfortable necessity rather than an act of cruelty. The reasons behind this practice were as varied as the individuals involved. Marriages were often arranged without love or mutual respect, and men and women found themselves trapped in unhappy unions for reasons that ranged from financial desperation to a simple lack of personal agency. Men, feeling trapped in their own marriages, sometimes saw wife-selling as an escape, albeit one that came with its own moral ambiguities. Women, on the other hand, found themselves pawns in a system that offered them little recourse or protection. The first whispers of wife-selling can be traced to small rural towns where poverty, sickness, and a rigid class system made it nearly impossible for people to live without desperation gnawing at their every decision. In these places, marriages could be ended with little more than a public spectacle. The most infamous of these events, perhaps, was the case of William Marshall and his wife, whose selling became an infamous moment in British history. But what led to such a drastic measure? Was it truly about the end of a marriage, or was it more a symptom of the fragile nature of human relationships in an unforgiving world? In the England of the 17th and 18th centuries, life was harsh, particularly for women. The rigid class structure, lack of social mobility, and limited legal rights meant that many were bound by societal norms and expectations. Marriage, in many ways, was the only escape for women, an often tenuous escape from the grip of poverty or the uncertainty of life. For men, however, marriage was often a necessary institution for maintaining their property, lineage, and social standing. It was a contract, one that sometimes carried as much weight as any financial or legal agreement. But within this framework, there existed an unsettling truth. Many marriages were unhappy, and many of those who were married lived lives of quiet, unspeakable misery. It was in these marriages, grounded in obligation and survival, that the practice of wife-selling began to emerge, an act of desperation that transcended social status and background. While love was not often part of the equation, there was a certain expectation of marital duty. Yet, when the strain of these marriages became too much to bear, some saw the selling of a wife as a solution. This wasn't an act of simple divorce, which was almost impossible to obtain. There were no courts that could intervene for the sake of personal happiness. In some places, a man could merely announce that his wife was up for sale. The ritualistic act of selling her often took place in front of a crowd, in marketplaces, fairs, or outside taverns, where the exchange would become a public spectacle. Yet the decision to sell one's wife was rarely taken lightly. In most cases, these women weren't simply passed from one man to another in the cold exchange of currency. They were human beings, caught in the middle of this spectacle, often with no other choice. Some women had found themselves in marriages that were, for lack of a better word, suffocating. In an era where a woman's worth was often tied to her ability to bear children and manage a household, the idea of leaving a marriage was not just scandalous, it was nearly impossible. But there were those who saw the sale as a form of empowerment, a way to reclaim some semblance of control over their lives. It was an act of defiance in the face of a system that had long controlled their destiny. In some cases, the wives were complicit in their own sale, sometimes with a hidden hope of escape, of finding a life beyond the confines of a loveless, abusive, or neglectful marriage. Yet for most, the reality of the situation was less glamorous. The wife-selling transaction, whether voluntary or coerced, was often an act of ultimate submission to a system that had stripped away every ounce of dignity. The truth was that these women had no recourse, no avenue through which to seek help or to escape the consequences of a system designed to keep them subjugated. One of the most infamous stories of wife-selling in England took place in the early 1700s, a time when public spectacles were a part of everyday life, especially in rural areas. William Marshall, a man from the countryside, found himself in a marriage that was doomed from the very start. His wife, whose name has been lost to history, was not a woman he loved, but one he had married out of necessity. The details of their initial meeting and marriage are lost to time, but it is known that by the time their marriage had soured, both William and his wife were locked in a troubled, unhappy union. It was in a small market town, in a public square, where William Marshall would make his decision to sell his wife. The event was not just a transaction, it was a spectacle. It was said that a crowd gathered, intrigued by the rumors of what was to come. Marshall, fed up with the marriage, stood in front of a crowd of curious onlookers, announcing his decision. He claimed that his wife was unfit for him, and that he was willing to part with her for a price. The transaction was simple in its terms. For a sum of money, he would transfer his wife to another man, offering her up as if she were a commodity. While it may seem almost absurd in its cruelty, for those who witnessed it, it was a sad reality of the time. Public wife-selling wasn't rare, and though it was morally unsettling, it was seen as an unfortunate, though acceptable, way to dissolve an unsatisfactory marriage. It was a moment that demonstrated just how fragile the bonds of marriage were for some people. But what of the woman at the heart of this spectacle? What did she feel as her husband handed her off, literally and figuratively, to a stranger in front of a crowd? She was a product of her time, a woman with no power to stop the transaction. Whether she agreed to the sale, whether she was coerced, or whether she simply saw it as an escape from a loveless union, remains unclear. In some cases, the wives involved were allowed to choose their new husbands, but in many others, they were simply handed over, as though they had no voice in their future. The Marshall incident quickly became a talking point in the town and beyond. The public spectacle, the shame, and the humiliation for all parties involved made it a remarkable and tragic event. While it wasn't the first time a wife had been sold in such a way, the drama surrounding Marshall's sale sparked heated discussions about marriage, the treatment of women, and the nature of consent in a society that largely ignored women's voices. But what was the lasting impact of such events? For some, it was a grim reminder of the limitations placed upon women, of their worth being measured not in terms of love or respect, but by the whims of their husbands. For others, it may have seemed like a necessary evil in a world where legal recourse and divorce were not available, and where the law did little to protect women from the whims of men. Yet, behind the spectacle and the public nature of these events, there was an underlying sadness, an undeniable truth that these women were being stripped of their humanity. The practice of wife-selling, while not universally accepted or practiced, became a symbol of how much power women truly had in their marriages. Almost none. As the years passed, the practice of wife-selling began to evoke more moral outrage. What had once been seen as an unfortunate but acceptable solution to marital strife began to be viewed by some as an abomination. Philosophers, religious figures, and reformists began speaking out against the public selling of wives, questioning not just the act itself, but the larger societal system that allowed such a practice to exist in the first place. The very idea of marriage, once seen as a sacred bond, was called into question. If a wife could be sold as though she were a piece of property, what did that say about the institution of marriage itself? Was it truly a partnership? Or was it simply a contract with one party bound by social and legal expectations, while the other enjoyed unearned power and control? Women, during this time, had no legal standing in marriage. They were bound by their husband's will, their worth measured by their ability to manage a household, bear children, and serve their husbands. Marriage was more a transaction of property and status than a relationship of mutual respect or love. The practice of wife-selling exposed just how fragile the rights of women truly were, and how easily they could be discarded once they were no longer deemed valuable. Religious leaders who had long preached the sanctity of marriage began to condemn these public sales of wives. They pointed to Scripture, to the teachings of the Church, and argued that the act went against the core values of compassion and respect. Some even saw the practice as a form of adultery, a sin that stained both the husband and the wife, forever marking them in the eyes of God. Yet, despite these protests, the practice continued, especially in rural areas where life was particularly harsh, and the bonds of marriage could feel suffocating. While some men and women found ways to work within the system to negotiate their marriages, For many others, wife-selling remained a dark but real option. As the practice of wife-selling continued to stir moral outrage, a shift began to occur within English society. The once accepted custom of selling wives became increasingly questioned, not just by religious and moral leaders, but by the emerging intellectual currents of the time. The Enlightenment had begun to make waves across Europe, bringing with it a new way of thinking, one that valued individual rights, the sanctity of personal liberty, and, for the first time in history, the idea that women, too, should have the freedom to choose their own fates. The rise of such thought was not without its critics. Conservative figures, often rooted in the old traditions of patriarchy, continued to defend the practice, arguing that it was simply a natural part of the social order. But as more voices from various walks of life began to speak out against it, the moral undercurrent shifted. The idea that a woman could be bought, sold, or traded like livestock seemed increasingly absurd. It was no longer just a local issue. It was one that threatened to undermine the entire system of gender relations in England. Some of the most vocal critics were women themselves. Though society had long relegated women to the margins, many were starting to see the consequences of such practices in a new light. Early feminists, though still a minority, began to push back against the idea that women could be treated as property. They argued that marriage, rather than being an institution that controlled women, should be a union of equals, based on mutual respect and affection. For them, the notion of wife-selling was a stark reminder of how far society had yet to go to grant women basic human dignity. Yet not all women saw it that way. Some women, particularly those in desperate situations, saw wife-selling as a means of survival, a way to escape the grip of an unhappy marriage, the control of a cruel husband, or the burden of poverty. In certain rural areas, where financial instability often led to dire situations, the ability to trade a wife became a necessary tool for both men and women trying to break free from suffocating circumstances. For these women, the act of being sold might seem like a bitter choice, but it was at least an option. For many, however, it was far from empowering. Those who were forced into these transactions often found themselves trapped in a system where their worth was defined by their ability to bear children or serve their husbands. The idea that a woman could be handed from one man to another, without regard for her personal desires, without a voice in the matter, was a reminder of just how little control women had over their lives. These women were powerless, with their fates controlled by the whims of their husbands, and in some cases the law and the church. The public outcry against wife-selling grew louder as newspapers began to pick up on the story. Scandalous reports of wife-selling made their way into the gossip columns, and public debates about women's rights and marriage became more frequent. Even some men, disillusioned by the very concept of marriage as a transactional contract, began to see the practice as an affront to basic human dignity. The more publicized the practice became, the more its moral and legal questions began to gain traction. But the change was slow. The legal system, still largely patriarchal, did little to protect women in these circumstances. There were no laws preventing wife selling, no recourse for women who were forced into such situations. In fact, it was often the case that once a woman was sold, she had no rights at all. She was seen as the property of her new husband, and any attempt to reclaim her independence was met with scorn. The law, it seemed, was not yet ready to help these women. As the years passed, however, calls for reform grew louder. The idea that marriage could be a contract based on mutual consent rather than ownership and servitude began to take root. It would be a long time before divorce laws were reformed in England, but the seeds of change were beginning to sprout. For all the philosophical debates and intellectual arguments about the morality of wife selling, there was another, more pressing reality: the women who lived through it. The lives of these women were marked by suffering, silence, and a lack of agency. While the events of their lives played out in public marketplaces or crowded town squares, their personal pain was hidden from view. The women involved in wife selling often had no say in the matter. For many, it was a consequence of a marriage that had gone terribly wrong. They had been married off at a young age, often without their consent, and spent their lives serving a husband they may have had little affection for. The idea of being sold was a grim reminder of their subjugation, a cruel reality of the social order they were forced to endure. It was said that many women who were sold in such transactions often felt as though they were being treated like cattle. Their worth was defined not by their humanity, but by their ability to serve a man, to keep a household, and to bear children. The act of being sold was, for many, the ultimate dehumanization, a public acknowledgement that they had no more value than an object to be exchanged. But there were exceptions. In some cases, a wife might find a better life after being sold. Perhaps her new husband was kinder, or perhaps the sale was a way for her to escape an abusive partner. However, these instances were rare, and the overwhelming majority of women found themselves trapped in a cycle of ownership and control that seemed impossible to break. These women's stories often went untold. The voices of the wives were rarely heard in the legal or historical accounts of wife selling. Instead, it was their husbands who took center stage in the transactions, with little regard for the women's emotions, desires, or rights. The real tragedy of wife selling wasn't just in the act itself, but in the silence that surrounded it. These women, whose lives were marked by hardship and cruelty, had no avenue for speaking out. They were trapped in a world where their voices didn't matter, where their worth was measured only in their ability to fulfill the roles assigned to them by society. As the 18th century drew to a close, England's society was beginning to change. The intellectual shifts that had begun with the Enlightenment were spreading, giving rise to new attitudes toward marriage, gender, and personal rights. Slowly, the rigid social and legal structures that had once held women in subjugation were being questioned. The practice of wife selling, once seen as an unfortunate but necessary means of dissolving a marriage, began to fall under intense scrutiny, both morally and legally. The first significant steps toward change came from the intellectual and moral philosophers of the time. With the rise of liberal thought, ideas surrounding individual rights, the sanctity of marriage, and the importance of personal agency began to gain traction. The concept of marriage as a contract based on mutual respect and consent became more widely discussed, especially in intellectual circles. However, for all the progress made in thought, it would take many more years before these ideas were translated into law. At the heart of this change was the growing acknowledgement that women, too, had rights. Rights that extended beyond the roles of wife and mother. For the first time, the question of women's autonomy was raised in earnest. The idea that a woman could be sold, used, or discarded without her consent seemed increasingly repugnant. It became a symbol of the deep gender inequality embedded in the fabric of English society. The legal system, however, was slow to react. The idea of wife selling was still not entirely illegal, and the law offered few protections for women trapped in such situations. While the practice wasn't widespread, it was common enough that it had become a cultural issue, and many began to argue that something had to be done. The debate over the treatment of women within marriage had begun in earnest, and it was clear that changes were needed to ensure that women had the ability to act as equal partners in a marriage. One of the turning points in the decline of wife selling came with the rise of divorce law reform. In the early 19th century, as attitudes toward marriage and gender roles continued to evolve, calls for divorce reform gained momentum. While divorce laws remained largely restrictive for much of this period, the idea that a woman could dissolve her marriage through legal means began to be discussed more widely. The slow progress of this movement would eventually lead to the Marriage Act of 1857, which allowed for civil divorce in England. Though still a long way from the equitable divorce laws we know today, this act marked the beginning of the end for the public practice of wife selling. The shift in legal norms also brought with it a change in public attitudes. No longer could a man simply announce that he was selling his wife like a piece of property. The very idea of such a transaction seemed increasingly barbaric in a world that was beginning to recognize the importance of individual rights and personal freedom. Yet, the process was slow and painful. For many women who had lived through the practice of wife selling, the changes came too late. Those who had been sold, those who had found themselves on the auction block, were left behind in a world that still struggled to understand the true depth of their suffering. They had been victims not only of a legal system that ignored their rights, but of a society that viewed them as little more than property. While the practice of wife selling began to fade into history, its legacy remained. For the women involved, the scars of being sold were not easily erased. These women had been treated as commodities, their worth measured by the whims of their husbands or the market forces that dictated their fate. Though laws and societal attitudes began to change, the emotional toll of such an experience was far more enduring. The women who had been sold were often left with little recourse for healing. Publicly humiliated, their dignity stripped away in front of a crowd, they faced a lifetime of stigma. The shame of being sold stayed with them, regardless of whether they were happy in their new marriages or not. Many of these women were abandoned by their families, rejected by society, and left to fend for themselves in a world that had shown them no mercy. The emotional burden on these women was immense. The act of being sold was a rejection of their humanity, an act that stripped away any sense of worth beyond their ability to serve a man. It was a painful reminder of how little control they had over their own lives. Though some women were able to find happiness in their new marriages, the majority suffered from deep psychological scars. The trauma of being traded, of being treated as a mere object, lingered long after the practice had been abandoned. Even as wife-selling became less common, the societal attitudes that allowed it to flourish persisted. Women were still largely seen as secondary to men, their roles defined by their ability to bear children and maintain households. The struggle for women's rights was far from over, and the emotional impact of wife-selling was only one piece of a much larger picture. In the years that followed, more women began to speak out, to demand their rights, to fight for a world where their voices were heard and their choices mattered. But the journey was far from easy. For many, the echoes of the past continued to haunt them, and the scars of the practice remained embedded in the collective memory of English society. By the mid-19th century, the feminist movement was beginning to gain momentum in England. Women like Mary Wollstonecraft, whose A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, had already challenged the traditional views on gender roles, paved the way for a more structured fight for women's rights. While the focus was initially on issues like education and employment, it wasn't long before the question of marriage and personal autonomy entered the conversation. The practice of wife-selling, though largely fading from public view, still served as a reminder of the entrenched patriarchal structures that had long defined the lives of women. The growing feminist movement, fueled by both intellectuals and the broader working-class women's rights groups, pushed forward the idea that women were equal to men, not just in the eyes of the law, but in every aspect of life. The feminist calls for legal and social equality would eventually help bring about the social reforms that recognized women as individuals, deserving of respect and equal treatment. As the 19th century unfolded, society in England began to see profound changes in the way women were perceived. The seeds of the feminist movement, which had been planted in the late 18th century by trailblazers like Mary Wollstonecraft, were starting to grow. While issues like education, employment, and suffrage began to dominate the conversation, the fundamental question of women's rights within marriage and the family was always at the forefront. The memory of wife-selling, though now largely a thing of the past, continued to serve as a painful reminder of how far society still had to go. For those who had lived through it, the memories of being treated as property were not easily forgotten. But the new wave of feminist thought was poised to bring about radical changes. Women were beginning to demand equality in all aspects of life, from the political to the personal. They sought control over their own lives, their bodies, and their futures. In the early decades of the 19th century, feminist thought began to focus on the institution of marriage. For many women, the concept of being owned by their husbands was no longer acceptable. It was no longer enough for a woman to simply serve the needs of her husband. Women wanted the right to make decisions about their own lives, and that included the right to choose their spouses and, if necessary, to leave marriages that were unhealthy or unfulfilling. The momentum toward legal reform began to grow stronger. In 1839, the Custody of Children Act was passed, allowing women to retain custody of their children in the event of divorce. A groundbreaking shift that began to challenge the idea that women were merely chattel to be transferred from one man to another. This was followed by other legal reforms, such as the Married Women's Property Act of 1882, which allowed women to own property in their own name, separate from their husbands. These reforms were not just about property or custody. They were about autonomy, freedom, and the recognition of women as full human beings. The feminist movement's calls for equality were gaining traction, and by the mid-19th century, the days of wife-selling were numbered. The decline of wife-selling did not happen overnight. While the intellectual and feminist movements worked to change the societal understanding of women's rights, the practice of selling wives persisted in some isolated areas for several decades. But with the rise of new legal frameworks and increasing societal awareness, the act of wife-selling began to be seen less and less as an acceptable solution to marital dissatisfaction. By the 1850s, with the first steps toward legal divorce reform and the gradual acknowledgement of women's rights, the practice was in rapid decline. The idea that a woman could be sold like an object or property became increasingly abhorrent to the general public. The media, which had once reported on wife-selling with a mix of morbid curiosity and detached neutrality, began to treat it as an example of the abuse of women. Newspapers and pamphlets became a voice for the growing feminist movement, calling for legal reforms, for the recognition of women's dignity and autonomy. In 1857, the Divorce and Matrimonial Causes Act was passed, allowing for civil divorce in England. This landmark legislation provided women with a legal pathway to escape unhappy marriages and helped eradicate the need for wife-selling. For the first time, women had the legal means to leave a marriage without being forced to resort to drastic and humiliating public acts of sale. While wife-selling had never been widespread across all of England, the reforms of the 19th century made it clear that such practices were no longer acceptable in a society that increasingly valued personal liberty, equality, and justice for all. The legislation, coupled with changing social attitudes, effectively put an end to the practice, ushering in a new era of marriage based on mutual respect and legal equity. However, the end of wife-selling did not mark the end of the struggle for women's rights. The path to full equality was long and fraught with obstacles, but the decline of wife-selling was a symbol of the changing tide. It was a reminder that the fight for women's rights, especially the right to personal agency within marriage, was gaining ground, As England moved toward legal reforms and a more equitable understanding of marriage, other countries began to take note. While the practice of wife-selling was not widespread across Europe, it was present in certain parts of the continent, particularly in rural and impoverished areas. The decline of wife-selling in England had a ripple effect, influencing other parts of the world where gender inequality was similarly entrenched. The story of wife-selling, once seen as a localized issue in England, became a symbol for the broader struggle for women's rights. It highlighted the need for legal reform, social change, and a reassessment of marriage and gender roles. The feminist movements in other countries, such as France and the United States, began to push for similar changes in the laws surrounding marriage, divorce, and women's autonomy. The eventual abolition of wife-selling helped shape a new vision of marriage, a partnership between equals rather than a hierarchical structure where one party held all the power. It also laid the foundation for the eventual feminist victories of the 20th century, such as the right to vote, access to education, and full legal equality. While the practice of wife-selling is largely forgotten in modern discourse, its legacy is still felt today. It serves as a reminder of the struggle that women faced throughout history, and the work that continues to be done to achieve true equality. The story of wife-selling is not just a relic of the past. It is a testament to the resilience and strength of women who fought, often in silence, for their rights and their dignity. As we reflect on the practice of wife-selling, it becomes clear that it was not merely a quirk of history or an isolated phenomenon. It was a product of a society that viewed women as property, as objects to be traded, used, and discarded. The practice was made possible by a legal and social system that did not recognize women as individuals with rights, agency, or autonomy. But it is also a story of change, of progress, and of the gradual, painstaking work of those who fought for the rights of women. The decline of wife-selling is part of the larger story of women's liberation, a story that continues to unfold to this day. It is a reminder that the fight for equality is ongoing, and that the struggles of the past should never be forgotten. While we have focused on the societal and legal shifts that led to the end of wife-selling, it is important to remember the human cost of this practice. The women who were subjected to it were not mere footnotes in history. They were real people with hopes, dreams, and fears. Women who, in many cases, found themselves trapped in a system that saw them as little more than property. Their stories, while rarely recorded in the historical record, are no less important than the men who sold them or the laws that eventually ended the practice. In the quiet corners of history, these women remain, their lives marked by suffering, resilience, and, ultimately, survival. They are a testament to the strength of women, even in the most oppressive of circumstances. Their stories deserve to be remembered, not as victims, but as survivors. Survivors of a system that sought to strip them of their humanity, but which ultimately could not break their spirits. The story of wife-selling is, in many ways, a story of progress, a journey from a time when women had no rights, no voice, and no agency, to a time when they began to demand recognition, equality, and autonomy. The end of wife selling was not the end of the struggle for women's rights, but it marked a critical turning point in that journey. As we look back on this dark chapter in history, we must recognize both the pain and the progress. The abolition of wife selling was a victory, but it was only one step in a much longer journey toward equality. Today, women continue to fight for their rights against oppression, discrimination, and violence. The lessons of history, though painful, are vital to understanding the work that still lies ahead. The story of wife selling is not one of hopelessness, but of hope. A hope that, through struggle, change is possible. And as we continue to fight for equality, let us remember the women whose lives were marked by this dark practice, and honor their legacy by working toward a world where no woman is ever again treated as property.